Clear Lake, Iowa, February 3rd, 1959. At 1:05 a.m., a small Beechcraft Bonanza carrying three of America's brightest young stars crashed into a snow-covered cornfield, instantly transforming fertile farmland into a white cemetery for youth that would never grow old. The impact created a crater in the frozen earth, a wound in the Iowa landscape that would heal over the decades but never truly disappear. Much like the scar this moment would leave on American music itself. Among the wreckage lay Ritchie Valens, 17 years old, 8 months from complete obscurity to cultural immortality, a trajectory so impossibly steep that it seemed more like mythology than biography. While his classmates were studying for SATs and worrying about prom dates, he had carried the sound of his guitar and the rhythm of La Bamba all the way to the Billboard charts. The boy who had dreamed of playing for the whole world had managed to change it forever in less time than most people spend in high school. The crash site became a monument to the terrible arithmetic of fame. 8 months from complete unknown to cultural immortal, a transformation so rapid it defied natural law. 8 months, while his former classmates were still deciding on college majors, Ritchie had rewritten the rules of American music. 8 months to prove that rock and roll could speak Spanish and still touch every heart that heard it. 8 months to live several lifetimes worth of dreams, and then silence. Ritchie had won that coin toss against Tommy Allsup, Buddy Holly's guitar player, in what seemed like a simple game of chance but was actually destiny disguised as luck. The coin spun through the frigid Iowa air, one side offering a 45-minute flight to comfort and warmth, the other side promising immortality purchased with 17 years of life. Tommy would catch the coin, call it correctly, lose the toss, and spend the next 60 years wondering why he had lived while others died. Ritchie would board the plane that he had won the right to board, trading what he thought was a cold bus ride for what would become an eternal journey into American mythology. "I just want to sing and make people happy," Ritchie had said in one of his final interviews. The earnest simplicity of someone who had never learned to be cynical about his own dreams, echoing with cruel irony across the decades. The boy who had been afraid of flying since witnessing a mid-air collision over his school had conquered that childhood terror for the sake of his music career, only to discover that some fears are not meant to be overcome, but respected. The phobia that had once kept him safely on the ground would prove prophetic when the thing he feared most became the instrument of his translation from earthly teenager to celestial legend. As news of the crash spread through radio stations across America, disc jockeys struggled to find words for a tragedy that seemed to represent something larger than 3 individual deaths. Don McLean would later call it the day the music died, but even that phrase couldn't capture the full scope of what had been lost when Ritchie Valens' voice was silenced forever. Here was a boy who had taken a traditional Mexican folk song called La Bamba and transformed it into a rock anthem that proved American music could embrace influences from anywhere, speak any language, and still touch the universal human desire to move, to dance, to feel alive. But was this really just a tragic accident, or had the music industry's relentless demands for touring and promotion created conditions that made such accidents inevitable? To understand how it all ended in that frozen Iowa cornfield, we must first journey back to the sun-baked streets of Pacoima, California, where a shy Mexican-American boy named Richard Steven Valenzuela discovered that music could be both escape from poverty and bridge to a world that had never made room for voices like his. In the working-class barrio of Pacoima in 1941, where the American dream felt more like a distant rumor than an achievable goal, Richard Steven Valenzuela was born into a world that would teach him early lessons about the power of music to transcend circumstances that seemed designed to limit possibility. His father, José Steven Valenzuela, was a tree trimmer whose irregular work provided just enough income to keep the family housed and fed, while his mother, Concepcion Concha Reyes, was a woman whose strength held the family together when economic pressures threatened to tear it apart. The Valenzuela household was filled with the sounds of traditional Mexican music that connected them to cultural roots, while also serving as soundtrack to daily struggles with poverty, discrimination, and the constant pressure to assimilate into an American society that regarded their heritage as something to be overcome rather than celebrated. Each song that played on their radio was both comfort and reminder of the distance between their current circumstances and the prosperity that seemed reserved for people whose names sounded more traditionally American. But it was the guitar that his father brought home when Richard was 5 that first revealed his capacity for transformation. His ability to take something simple and make it extraordinary through pure instinct and inexhaustible practice. The instrument was second-hand and barely playable, but in Richard's hands it became a portal to possibilities that extended far beyond the limitations of their neighborhood. Each chord he mastered was both musical achievement and act of rebellion against a world that expected Mexican-American children to accept restricted ambitions. The young boy, who would later be known as Ritchie Valens, displayed from his earliest years the qualities that would make him famous and ultimately lead to his death. An instinctive understanding of how different musical traditions could be combined to create something unprecedented. A natural performance ability that could make anyone stop what they were doing and listen. And most dangerously, a willingness to take risks that more cautious people would avoid. School offered little inspiration for someone whose mind was already occupied with musical possibilities that had no connection to traditional academic subjects, but it provided the first audiences for performances that revealed his extraordinary ability to connect with people through music that seemed to speak directly to whatever emotions they were trying to process or escape. Each impromptu hallway concert was both artistic expression and social education, as Richard learned that music could make him popular with classmates who might otherwise dismiss him as just another poor kid from the wrong side of town. Could these early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? The evidence was written in every song he would later compose, which combined the emotional directness of traditional Mexican music with the rebellious energy of rock and roll, creating a sound that was both deeply personal and universally appealing. The boy who learned to play guitar on a broken instrument was developing skills that would later allow him to make perfect music under the most imperfect circumstances. The family's move to a slightly better neighborhood when Richard was in middle school provided both opportunity and pressure, as he found himself navigating between the Mexican-American community that had shaped his identity and the broader American culture where his musical ambitions would either flourish or die. Each day required choosing between maintaining connections to his heritage and pursuing dreams that seemed to require abandoning everything that made him different from the white rock and roll stars who dominated radio airwaves. But rather than choosing between his two worlds, Richard began developing the musical vision that would make him unique. The understanding that American music was strongest when it incorporated influences from all the cultures that made up American society, rather than pretending that authenticity required cultural purity. The songs he began writing in his early teens were both love letters to his Mexican heritage and declarations of independence from anyone who believed that rock and roll could only be performed by people who looked and sounded a certain way. The high school talent shows where he first performed original compositions were both artistic breakthroughs and social experiments, as audiences discovered that music they had never heard before could move them in ways that familiar songs could not. Each performance was evidence of his growing confidence that his different background was an asset rather than a liability, that the music industry might be ready for artists who could expand rather than simply imitate existing formulas. The transformation from Richard Valenzuela to Ritchie Valens began not with a conscious decision to abandon his heritage, but with a recognition that the music industry of the 1950s was more likely to embrace a performer whose name sounded more accessible to mainstream American audiences. The change was both practical necessity and symbolic sacrifice, as the teenager who had been proud of his family name learned that success might require making compromises that felt like betrayals of the people who had supported his dreams when no one else believed they were possible. The talent scout who discovered Ritchie performing at a local venue was looking for fresh faces to compete with Elvis Presley and the other young stars who were reshaping popular music. But what he found was something unprecedented. A teenage performer who could make rock and roll sound both familiar and completely new by incorporating musical elements that most American audiences had never heard integrated into popular songs. The recording contract that followed was both validation of his talent and introduction to an industry that would celebrate his uniqueness, while systematically exhausting the person who created it. The early recording sessions that produced Come On, Let's Go revealed Ritchie's capacity for channeling authentic teenage emotions into musical performances that captured the universal experience of young people trying to figure out their place in a world that seemed designed by and for adults. The song was both personal expression and commercial calculation, designed to appeal to the growing market of teenagers who were becoming the primary consumers of rock and roll music. But the same authenticity that made his performances compelling also made him vulnerable to an industry that treated young performers as raw material to be processed into commercial products rather than artists whose creative development required patience and protection. Each successful recording was both artistic achievement and stepped deeper into a professional world that had no interest in preserving whatever qualities had made him valuable in the first place. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The evidence was accumulating in Ritchie's increasing awareness that his musical success was creating distance between himself and the family and community that had shaped his identity, while also failing to provide the kind of artistic fulfillment that had motivated his original interest in music. The boy who had started playing guitar to make people happy was discovering that the happiness he created for others was becoming more important than his own emotional well-being or creative satisfaction. The recording of Donna, a ballad he wrote for his high school girlfriend Donna Ludwig, represented both artistic maturity and recognition that his personal experiences were being transformed into commercial products that would be consumed by millions of people who would never know anything about the authentic emotions that had inspired them. The song was both love letter and farewell, as Ritchie understood that his rising fame was making normal teenage relationships impossible to maintain. Behind all that apparent success and excitement, was there already a young man struggling to balance the demands of a music career with the normal developmental needs of someone who was still figuring out his own identity and values? The teenager who sang about love and happiness was learning that fame could provide everything except the kinds of authentic relationships and personal stability that actually created those emotions in real life. The breakthrough recording of La Bamba in late 1958 represented both the peak of Ritchie's artistic achievement and the creation of a cultural bridge that would outlive him by generations. This was no longer just a traditional Mexican wedding song. It had become something entirely new, a rock anthem that proved American music could speak any language and still touch universal human desires to move, dance, and feel alive. The transformation required not just musical skill but cultural courage, as Ritchie was betting his entire future on the radical belief that American teenagers were ready for music that challenged their assumptions about what rock and roll could sound like. But La Bamba would become more than just a hit record. After the crash, it transformed into something even more powerful, a funeral song for lost innocence, the soundtrack to an entire generation's first real encounter with the arbitrary cruelty of fate. The song that had once celebrated life and love became an anthem of mortality, played at memorials and tributes where people tried to make sense of how someone so young could be gone so suddenly. La Bamba was no longer just Mexican wedding music or American rock. It had become the bittersweet melody of youth interrupted, promising that some voices continue singing even after the singers have been silenced. The transformation of La Bamba from traditional wedding song to rock classic required not just musical skill but cultural courage, as Ritchie was essentially betting his career on the belief that American teenagers were ready for music that challenged their assumptions about what rock and roll could sound like. The recording sessions revealed his growing sophistication as both performer and producer, as he understood that the song's success would depend on maintaining its authentic Mexican elements while making it accessible to audiences who might be hearing Spanish lyrics in a rock song for the first time. The immediate success of La Bamba created both vindication and pressure, as Ritchie discovered that he had accidentally created a template for multicultural rock music that would influence generations of performers, but that also established expectations about his role as representative of Mexican-American culture in the entertainment industry. Each interview and public appearance now carried weight beyond simple promotion, as he was expected to speak for an entire community rather than simply as a young musician trying to develop his artistic voice. The recording career that paralleled his meteoric rise was both artistic fulfillment and crash course in the brutal economics of teenage stardom. Each session at Gold Star Studios revealed not just Ritchie's growing sophistication as a performer, but also the relentless pressure to produce commercial hits that could capitalize on his breakthrough success before the fickle teenage market moved on to the next sensation. The industry that celebrated his cultural innovation also demanded constant repetition of the formula that had made him valuable, creating an impossible tension between artistic growth and commercial survival. The relationship with his producer Bob Keane was both mentorship and exploitation wrapped in the kind of paternal concern that made predatory contracts seem like generous opportunities. Keane understood that Ritchie's youth and inexperience made him vulnerable to terms that prioritized immediate commercial success over long-term artistic development or financial security. Each recording session was both creative collaboration and business transaction, where the teenager's naivety about industry standards made him easy prey for adults whose primary concern was extracting maximum profit from his brief moment of marketability. The pressure to follow up La Bamba and Donna with equally successful recordings created a studio atmosphere where artistic experimentation was secondary to commercial calculation. Ritchie found himself torn between his instinctive desire to explore new musical territories and the industry's demand that he reproduce the exact combination of elements that had made his breakthrough recordings successful. Each take was both artistic expression and market research, as producers searched for the mysterious alchemy that could transform a Mexican-American teenager's authentic emotions into commercial gold. The touring schedule that accompanied his recording success was designed by adults who had no understanding of what constant travel and performance pressure could do to someone who was still emotionally and physically developing. The Winter Dance Party tour that would end his life was just the latest in a series of exhausting commitments that treated teenage performers like machines capable of producing entertainment on demand without regard for their psychological or physical welfare. The bus that carried the performers from city to city was barely heated, poorly maintained, and completely inadequate for winter travel across the upper Midwest. Each night required performing for audiences who expected the same energy and enthusiasm regardless of how little sleep the performers had gotten, how inadequate their meals had been, or how many consecutive days they had been traveling without proper rest. The conditions were so harsh that several performers developed frostbite, flu, and other ailments that made each performance an act of endurance rather than artistic expression. But perhaps most devastating was the isolation from family and community that touring created for someone who had never been away from home for extended periods. The letters Ritchie wrote to his mother during his final tour revealed a teenager who was homesick, exhausted, and increasingly aware that the success he had dreamed of was costing him connection to everything that had made him want to pursue music in the first place. Each performance was taking him further from the backyard gatherings where he had first discovered the joy of making people happy with his guitar, further from the simple pleasure of playing music for people who loved him regardless of whether he was famous. The family dynamics that shaped Ritchie's early years became even more complex as his fame grew, and the economic realities of supporting a successful performer began to affect everyone in the Valenzuela household. His mother, Concepcion, found herself simultaneously proud of her son's achievements and terrified by the demands that success was placing on someone she still saw as her baby. The woman who had once worried about Richard getting to school safely was now watching him travel across the country with strangers, performing for thousands of people who screamed his name but knew nothing about the shy boy who still called home every night when the touring schedule permitted. The financial benefits of Ritchie's success were both blessing and source of new pressures, as the family that had once struggled to pay basic bills was suddenly dealing with contracts, royalties, and business decisions that none of them were equipped to understand or evaluate. Each check that arrived from the record company was both validation of Richard's talent and reminder that their son's life had become a commercial enterprise where his emotional and physical welfare were secondary considerations to profit margins and market timing. The younger siblings who had once been annoyed by Richard's constant guitar practice were now dealing with the strange experience of hearing their brother's voice on radio stations across the country, while struggling to reconcile the famous Ritchie Valens with the brother who had shared their bedroom and helped with household chores just months earlier. Each family gathering became both celebration and mourning, as they celebrated his success while grieving the loss of the simple family life they had enjoyed, before fame changed everything about their daily existence. The neighborhood in Pacoima that had nurtured Ritchie's early musical development was also transformed by his success, as local venues that had once provided intimate settings for his performances became pilgrimage sites for fans who wanted to experience some connection to their idol's origins. The backyard where he had first played La Bamba for family gatherings was now pointed out to strangers as the birthplace of a revolution. But the family members who remembered those early performances understood that something essential had been lost in the translation from private joy to public spectacle. The cultural significance of Ritchie's success was both personal triumph and community responsibility, as he found himself expected to represent not just his own artistic vision, but the hopes and dreams of every Mexican-American teenager who had been told that rock and roll was not for people like them. Each interview, each photograph, each public appearance carried weight beyond simple entertainment, as journalists and fans searched for evidence that his success represented broader changes in American attitudes toward Latino culture and performers. But the pressure to be a cultural ambassador was exhausting for someone who had never intended to become a symbol of anything larger than his own musical ambitions. The boy who had simply wanted to make people happy with his guitar was learning that happiness was a complicated emotion when it came weighted with expectations about social change, cultural representation, and the kind of inspirational narrative that made adults feel good about progress while placing impossible burdens on the teenagers who were supposed to embody that progress. The final months of Ritchie's life were marked by increasing awareness that the career he had built was consuming the person who had created it, as each professional obligation took him further from the musical joy that had motivated his original interest in performance. The recording sessions that had once felt like play now felt like work. The touring that had once seemed like adventure now felt like endurance test. And the fame that had once seemed like validation now felt like a cage whose bars were made of other people's expectations and commercial demands. Behind all that glamour, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The evidence was mounting in Ritchie's letters home, which revealed someone who was grateful for his success but increasingly homesick for the simple pleasures of family dinners, neighborhood friends, and the kind of musical experiences that were motivated by joy rather than commercial obligations. The teenager who had dreamed of playing for the whole world was discovering that achieving that dream meant giving up most of the experiences that had made him want to play music in the first place. The winter dance party tour that would end his life was both career milestone and warning sign, as the grueling schedule of performances across the frozen Midwest in the depths of winter created conditions that no 17-year-old should have been expected to endure. The tour bus that broke down repeatedly, the inadequate heating, the exhaustion that accumulated from performing in a different city every night. All of these factors contributed to a situation where booking a small plane for a single flight seemed like reasonable solution rather than dangerous risk. The decision to fly from Clear Lake, Iowa to Moorhead, Minnesota was motivated by practical concerns rather than reckless ambition, as Ritchie and his fellow performers were simply trying to get to their next venue in time for a performance while also getting some rest in a heated environment. But the same commercial pressures that had made him a star were also creating conditions where young performers were expected to prioritize professional obligations over personal safety or health. Did this tragic event mark their downfall? Or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The plane that crashed had been chartered because the tour's logistics were inadequate for the weather conditions and travel distances involved. But the crash also represented the culmination of an industry approach that treated young performers as renewable resources rather than human beings whose welfare required active protection. The coin toss that determined Ritchie's place on the plane was both random chance and symbolic representation of how little control he had over circumstances that would determine his survival. Tommy Allsup, who lost the toss and therefore remained on the tour bus, would spend the rest of his life thinking about the arbitrary nature of fate and the terrible mathematics of survival. In an industry that calculated success in terms of ticket sales rather than human costs, the hours before the flight were filled with the kind of routine backstage activities that characterized every stop on the tour. Equipment checks, conversations with local promoters, interactions with fans who were excited to see performers they had only heard on radio or seen on television. Nothing about the evening suggested that it would be different from dozens of other performances, except for the weather that was making travel between venues increasingly difficult and dangerous. The plane that took off from Clear Lake Airport at 12:55 a.m. was carrying 3 young men who had revolutionized American popular music, but who were still essentially teenagers dealing with adult responsibilities and pressures that they were not equipped to handle. The pilot, Roger Peterson, was experienced but not trained for instrument flying in the weather conditions that prevailed that night, creating a situation where multiple factors combined to produce a tragedy that might have been avoided with different decisions by several different people. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? For Ritchie, there would be no opportunity to learn from the experience, no chance to develop the wisdom that might have helped him make safer choices in the future. The 17-year-old who had been afraid of flying since witnessing a plane crash over his school had conquered that fear for the sake of his career, only to have his worst nightmare become reality in the most mundane possible circumstances. The impact occurred just minutes after takeoff, in a snow-covered field where the only witnesses were the winter wind and the stars that Ritchie had often gazed up at while dreaming of musical success. The boy who had trembled with terror watching planes fall from the sky above his elementary school playground was now experiencing the very nightmare that had haunted his childhood dreams. The crash was both sudden ending and cosmic irony. The fear he had conquered for his career had been waiting all along to claim him, patient as fate itself. The wreckage scattered across the frozen cornfield created a tableau that would haunt investigators and inspire songwriters for decades. Here was proof that fame offered no protection from the basic fragility of human existence, that all the screaming fans and Billboard success meant nothing when physics met flesh and metal met earth. The same winter weather that had made touring so miserable had also created the conditions for this final performance, this devastating finale to a story that had barely had time to begin. When news of the crash reached Pacoima, the family and community that had supported Ritchie's dreams confronted the terrible mathematics of their loss. 8 months earlier, their neighborhood had produced a local boy who could play guitar. Now they were mourning an international star whose music would outlive everyone who had known him before he became famous. The boy who had left home as Richard Valenzuela had died as Ritchie Valens, but the family grieving his loss could only remember the shy teenager who had played La Bamba in their backyard, making his mother cry with pride and worry in equal measure. The funeral that followed was both celebration of cultural achievement and confrontation with mortality that seemed particularly cruel when applied to someone who had died before discovering who he might have become. The casket that held Ritchie's body also held the dreams of everyone who had believed that talent and determination could overcome the limitations that society had placed on Mexican-American youth. Each flower, each prayer, each tear shed at his service was both tribute to what he had accomplished and mourning for everything he would never have the chance to attempt. The Iowa cornfield has long since returned to agricultural use, endless rows of corn growing over the site where 3 young stars fell to earth. But beneath that fertile soil, something else grows. The legend of the boy who brought Mexican wedding songs into American rock and roll, who proved that music could cross any border and speak any language, who died at 17 but left 17 years suspended in amber, never growing old, never losing the innocent belief that music could make people happy. The cornfield is both grave and garden now, producing crops that feed the living while nurturing memories that feed the soul. Ritchie Valens had dreamed of playing for the whole world, and his death ensured that wish would be granted in ways that life never could have provided. But that success came at the ultimate price, the silencing of a voice that had only begun to explore its possibilities, the grounding of a spirit that had learned to fly just in time to fall forever. Were these final decisions acts of surrender, or courageous acts of self-preservation? The question would never be answered because Ritchie had no opportunity to make conscious choices about the circumstances that led to his death. The teenager who had always been willing to take risks for the sake of his music had taken one final risk that he didn't even realize he was taking. Boarding a plane that he hoped would simply get him to the next venue where he could continue doing what he loved most. The morning of February 3rd, 1959 dawned cold and gray over Iowa, the kind of weather that seemed designed for mourning rather than celebration, for endings rather than new beginnings. The bodies recovered from the crash site revealed the terrible vulnerability of young performers who had seemed invincible when they were commanding audiences and climbing record charts, but who were revealed to be as fragile as anyone else when confronted with forces beyond their control. The impact had been instantaneous and unsurvivable, sparing the passengers the kind of prolonged suffering that might have made their deaths even more tragic. But the quickness of their ending also meant that they had no opportunity for final words, last messages, or any kind of conscious conclusion to lives that had been devoted to creating art that would outlast their physical existence. The investigation that followed the crash revealed multiple contributing factors: weather conditions, pilot inexperience with instrument flying, possibly inadequate equipment maintenance, but no single cause that could fully explain why 3 young men who had been alive and performing just hours earlier were now silent forever. The randomness of the tragedy was perhaps its most disturbing element, as it suggested that similar disasters could occur without warning or prevention. whenever commercial pressures combined with challenging conditions to create perfect storms of risk. When news of the deaths reached radio stations across America, disc jockeys found themselves in the unprecedented position of having to announce that multiple major recording artists had died simultaneously in an accident that seemed to represent something larger than individual tragedy. The same voices that had been playing Ritchie's music just hours earlier now had to find ways to memorialize performers who had barely begun their careers, but who had already changed the sound of popular music. The funeral services that followed were both celebrations of artistic achievement and confrontations with mortality that seemed particularly cruel when applied to performers who had died before reaching adulthood. Ritchie's service in San Fernando was attended by family, friends, and industry figures who were still struggling to understand how someone so young and vital could be gone so suddenly, leaving behind only recordings and memories of performances that would have to represent the entirety of his artistic legacy. The burial in San Fernando Mission Cemetery became a pilgrimage site for fans who needed some physical location where they could pay respects to a performer whose influence would continue growing long after his death. The grave marker that simply read Richard Stephen Valenzuela represented both return to his authentic identity and recognition that Ritchie Valens had been a performance persona that died with the person who created it. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The answer was written in every contract that prioritized tour schedules over performer safety, every business decision that treated young artists as commercial assets rather than human beings with rights to reasonable working conditions. Every industry practice that normalized exploitation of performers who were too young and inexperienced to protect themselves from systematic abuse. The forces that killed Ritchie Valens were not hidden. They were celebrated as show business, professional success, and the American dream itself. The teenager who had wanted to sing and make people happy had discovered that the music industry was more interested in profits than in the welfare of the people who generated those profits. But he had learned this lesson too late to save himself from its consequences. He had lived as a shooting star, burned bright for 8 months of unprecedented success, and died as a symbol of youth and talent destroyed by an industry that had no systems in place to protect the vulnerable young people whose creativity it exploited for commercial purposes. The boy who had brought Mexican music into the heart of American rock and roll had proven that cultural boundaries were artificial constructs that could be transcended by authentic artistic vision. But he had also demonstrated the terrible costs that such boundary crossing could exact from the people brave enough to attempt it. The legacy he left behind would influence generations of performers who would build careers on the multicultural foundation he had established. But the price he paid for creating that foundation was everything he had never had the chance to experience. Adulthood, artistic maturity, the opportunity to see how far his music could travel and how many people it could touch across cultures and decades. The cornfield in Iowa where he died has returned to agricultural use, but the music he created in his brief career continues to grow and spread like seeds planted in soil that proved more fertile than anyone could have imagined. Ritchie Valens had dreamed of playing for the whole world, and his death ensured that his wish would be granted in ways that life never could have provided. But the cost of that posthumous success was the silencing of a voice that had only begun to explore its own possibilities when it was lost forever to the mathematics of tragedy and the terrible arithmetic of fame.